Thank you, Martin, and again, all of you for being here and for your solidarity with us in this difficult time. I want to say a few words because the Greek problem, later on it became a peripheral problem. Some were talking about the problem of the pigs, and I said in Warsaw, I'm proud to be one of the pigs. This goes, I think, to the core of some of the issues we have, or the major issues we have as Europeans, and where Europe is going. I would say in the need to have a Europe which is socially just, governed in a democratic way, with democratic governance, to deal with many of the challenges we have, which are not just the financial. They are the environmental, they are the issues of job creation, the issues of how we define competitiveness as a progressive movement, and how we also, what is our role in the world as it's changing so rapidly. Just to look a few kilometers from here to the south, we see in Egypt, in Libya, and Tunisia. I would say that our role is to democratize and to humanize our global, our European, our national economies and societies. And I say this because the conservatives are creating a number of myths, and they use Greece often to create these myths, and I want to give you my view about this. One of the myths is that the markets will solve the problems. We know this myth. On Greece, people were saying, well, if Greece, and in the same sense, if Portugal just does what is right, what is necessary, everything will be fine. As a matter of fact, Greece has made very big changes. We had to take very difficult decisions because of the huge debt and deficit from the previous government. Pensions, wages have been slashed. But we are on track for our spending cuts. We made painful sacrifices to prevent bankruptcy, embarked on an aggressive fiscal consolidation program, reducing our deficit by 6 percentage points. No one believed we could reach that. Changing Greece, of course, is not simply around the issue of debt, but it's bringing in new opportunities, fighting vested interests, and fulfilling our economic potential. We have changed our tax system to make it fairer and more efficient. We have made a budget reform to cut waste and control expenditures. We have full transparency. Everything is online. Every expenditure is online today in Greece. Reforms to decentralize government. We have made major changes for local government. We have opened about 100 professions which were closed. We are cutting down bureaucracy for fast-track investment. We have changed our pension system to make it a viable system, and we have launched programs which are either to develop our public assets or to privatize our public assets, from airports to ports to roads, even gaming. As a result of this, Greece is projected, knock on wood, to be one of the few countries in Europe with a primary surplus in 2012. And I say this because Greece is by no means a poor country. It is a country which had poor governance. That's why I put the issue of democratic governance as quite important. Squandering resources, clientelistic policies rather than meritocratic, privileges for the few, tax breaks for the few. These were some, of course, lack of transparency and even corruption were some of the issues which created the problems here in Greece. I say this because even though we have done this, we do not see the response of the markets. I said this earlier in the press conference. A number of reasons. There is panic in the markets, protracted recession, biting austerity measures. These are things which sometimes the markets even see as not helping for growth. We see that also there are missing bricks in the architecture of our common currency. No common treasury, no coordinated economic policy. And the high anxiety and insecurity in the markets in our populations, the prophecies of doom, market worries about future debt, growth potential of the European Union, the credit rating agencies that are not accountable to anyone, all these are affecting our economy and our prospects. And that is why I think it was very important to Europe making a decision. As I said earlier, sometimes it looks like we're too little too late, making a decision which was, however, a decision of solidarity. And that shows the strength we have. Martin said earlier, which I agree very much, we are not weak. We may not realize the power we have, and I've said this very often, even in the Council. We have the power to make the changes and to protect our economies and develop our economies. But we are too prone to accept or expect that the markets will solve everything. In the end, Europe did come and created a mechanism to intervene in the markets and unite in solidarity with Greece in order to fight for a common future. Now, whether this is enough is another question, and we can get into that if you like in the question and answers. A second important, I believe, myth, that the crisis, of course, was one of debt and deficit in Greece, but what were the underlying causes? Was it too much spending, a leisure, profligacy, the welfare state? That's what they say, the conservatives. It is the welfare state that is behind the problem, and therefore we have to deal with the welfare state. However, debt and deficit, as I said earlier, were symptoms of bad management. Yes, we did have to revamp our pension system, but in the end, this was not profligacy on the welfare state. It wasn't the pensions, it wasn't the unemployment benefits, the education or health care, which are to blame for Europe's economic crisis. I believe that if we look at the crisis where it began in the US, in the United States, I think it's very important that we see financial markets where there's lack of transparency, lack of monitoring, fraud with the allocation of AAA bonds, which were toxic bonds. These were corrupt practices which were not controlled, and this put the US and the world into a free fall, almost a deep recession if we didn't have some Keynesian measures which came in to stop this free fall. I say that because in many of the analyses that have come out around this Great Recession and linking this with the Great Depression, one thing that is very interesting in comparing the Great Depression with this recession we just had, by people such as Bob Reich, who was the former Labor Secretary in the United States, or Joe Stiglitz or Paul Krugman, Nobel laureates, they say that the core of the problem was inequality. The core of the problem was inequality in many ways. One way was that the need for, because of the inequality, the need for our societies to be able to sustain a level of living standards meant that they had to borrow very much. So you had many countries that had high private debt. But there is a deeper political problem. These huge inequalities created a massive inequality in power. Much suffering, much crime, much corruption of even our democratic institutions because of the concentration of power. I just want to say, give you just a few statistics. There's an interesting author who wrote about these just a year ago about the superclass. His name is Rothkopf, and he says that there are basically 6,000 people that control the world today in what he calls Richistan. It's the country of the rich, where 10% of the world population controls 85% of the global wealth, 2% controls 50% of the global wealth, where GDP of 60 countries is over 50 billion, but there are 166 corporations that have over 50 billion yearly annual results. And of course, there are in the trillions in the CDSs, the so-called derivative markets. What does this mean? And I want to touch on a subject which I know has recently been important also for our party. The issue of corruption. Is this an ethical issue? Obviously, it's an ethical issue also. But it is much more an issue of democracy, of the strength of our institutions vis-à-vis the strength and concentration of wealth, power, media in the hands of the few. Just two or three examples. An author writing about the bottom billion, the poorest bottom billion in the world, his name is Paul Collier, makes an interesting comparison between Norway and Nigeria. They both have oil, they both have petroleum, a lot of petroleum. But he says in one country the revenues go to the state, and the other country the revenues go to the minister. Now, what is behind this? It is the question of institutions and democratic governance. And the question of democratic governance is very important. We see this even if we look at what's happening in the world, the Muslim and the Arab world now. If you listen to the slogans in Tahrir Square just a few weeks ago in Egypt, they were not only for democracy, they were saying, bring back the money to the people. Now, it's obvious that in countries that have not a long history of democracy, that there is weak institutions that can be captured by strong interests. But today, even in the developed countries, even in our developed world of developed democracies, we have the similar problem. And I want to put that to you because if you see, for example, the lobbies in the United States, Jeffrey Sachs just wrote, I think in an article today or yesterday in the Financial Times, he says, well, the difference between the Republican and the party of the Democratic Party in the United States is that the Republicans get their electoral money from the oil interests and the Democrats get their electoral money from Wall Street. Now, I don't know which is better, but this just shows the strength of the power that we are facing as democratic institutions. And this is a question of democracy. We elected politicians are disempowered in this global financial, globalized economy. And therefore, it is understandable that our youth are saying, well, why aren't you politicians not making the decisions? Well, that is because we do not have that power that people believe we have. Democracy is being undermined. We do need a democratic revolution. We do need to strengthen our institutions, and I think this is very important for Europe. And when we show that we can work together as a European Union in a democratic way, expressing the wills of the people, we can deal with many problems. This also, I would add, links to another problem, which I then will link to competitiveness before I close. People are saying that revenues and the economy is the way it is, the globalized economy means that revenues are going from the developed world to the developing world or the emerging economies, where, of course, there is more wealth, more people getting jobs, better standards of living. But in fact, it's not so much that they are going in a world which is flat from the developed to the developing or emerging markets. Much of the money, or most of the money, is going up to a stratosphere, to the rich, to a few. And some is going, yes, to the workers of China and India. Some is taken away from the workers in the developed world. But most of the money in this globalized society is going up to a different part, to another dimension. Another world which has very few rules, which has little accountability, which has no borders, and very few taxes. And this is not a competition between Asia, Europe, or the USA. It is, in the end, yes, a difference between our populations and a new class that is being developed at the globalized level. So we are seeing here a huge concentration of power with wealth, with media, arms, knowledge, technology in the hands of a few. The issue of tax evasion, for example, is not simply a Greek problem. It is a wider problem. It is certainly a Greek problem also. Some say that there may be tax evasion reaching 1 trillion euros every year in Europe, but that is why also it is very important that we have just proposed, I would say, a simple measure as socialists, that is of the financial transaction tax, one of the possible measures, which shows the need for global governance. I had a fight in the Council only a few days ago because the Council was saying, some members of the Council were saying, we can only do this at a global level, and what they meant basically is we can never do it because you will never have a global tax. And I was saying, and luckily there were quite a few others, even some conservatives I must recognize, who were saying, let's begin in Europe. Let's begin in Europe and do this. So we were able to get a mandate for the Commission to bring us a proposal by the end of the summer. That doesn't mean the fight is over. I think the fight has just begun. But I think this is again where you, Martin, Poul Rasmussen, and of course the group here has played a very major role in helping in this area. Let me say a few things about the competitiveness issue. We recently agreed on the Euro Pact. Obviously, when we, and the Parliament also helped very much here, to enhance the terms of this Euro Pact so that it is not sort of a suit that has to be fit on every size and every country, but there are different ways of seeing what competitiveness may mean as a more integral part of dealing also with convergence, growth, and job creation, also respecting some of the traditions, particularly collective bargaining, and so on. These, I think, are important, which have been a part of the fight that we socialists made in trying to change this Euro Pact. But, and of course, the question of whether there should be put into the Constitution or that, we have said that each country should be able on his or her own to decide how we will deal with our debt in a correct and our deficit in a correct and viable way. Also, we put in a fight to make sure that the pact, the Euro Pact, and its implementation was compatible with the treaty, community method, respect to the jurisdictions of the role of the European Commission, and of course the European Parliament. Despite this, of course, there is an ideological rift here, and we see again, of course, that there is a shift, an economic shift towards Asia and the emerging economies. The question is, how are we going to compete with the emerging economies? And here I think there are two different paradigms. Obviously, you have, on the one hand, the emerging markets, and they have a comparative advantage because of cheap labor, because of lack of collective bargaining, sometimes even lack of democratic rights, the capability for environmental degradation, very simply. And these are comparative advantages. They are short-term comparative advantages, but they are comparative advantages. But the question is that the model we want to emulate? Is that the model that we Europeans want to emulate? And I think we socialists are very clear on this. This is not the model we should emulate. We want a different model. And it is not cheap labor, it is not the lack of collective bargaining, and not the lack of social rights, it's not the lack of environmental protection that we want. It is, I would say, competitiveness based on quality and not competitiveness based on inequality. It is based on quality. And here we were saying with Martin just a few minutes ago that we have models that are viable. We have models in there. We have the Nordic model, which is there, even though the Nordic model is being pressured, of course, by these global forces. But there is a Nordic model which says you can have a competitive economy which is also has the highest G coefficient is called the Gini coefficient of equality, which has social cohesion, and which also invests in human capacity and in quality. And it so happens that they seem to be of the happiest nations around the world, too. So why is it that model that we do not emulate, and we have to emulate some very conservative neoliberal kind of a model? And this is why I think we need to get out on the offensive on this. Obviously, we need to also develop our economies, and investment and development is important. Growth is important. And even though I recognize, and I have been the first to say this in Greece, that we need to put our house in order, and we've taken very difficult measures, I also recognize that we need to have growth in Europe. Now, if we can't do it at the national level, we can do it at the European level. Is it the financial transaction tax which will give us extra revenue? Is it the Eurobonds which will be used for projects? These are possibilities. These are possibilities where the Eurobonds could be used for big projects. We want an energy grid. We want green economy. We want to move to a competitive, innovative, knowledge-based economy. We want infrastructure where we connect the single market so that the Central and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe can connect with Northern and Western Europe, and we can be a much stronger economy. So this is again an area where we have been at the forefront. The socialists have been at the forefront in dealing with this issue. My point is, my final conclusion is that we need a new model for growth. We need a new model for governance. We need a new model for cooperation in Europe also. One thing I see, and this may be one of the biggest challenges, is that without this new model, without this prospect of social justice and equality, without this prospect of moving to a green economy, without the prospect of greater democratic governments and transparency where all pay equally, and we don't have, as was said earlier, the banks getting loans 1% and the others 10% interest rates. This means we need to work together, and our strength is in our unity, and we need to unite our peoples. And we as socialists, I think, need to do this more than anyone else. It's more difficult because when you have an elite of 6,000 around the world, or maybe just 1,000 or 500 in Europe, it is easier for them with their Gulfstream jets to meet with each other and talk and decide. For us, it is much more difficult to organize our societies across borders. And we have a problem because there is because of the problems Europe has, there is a turning into ourselves in a more nationalistic and xenophobic way. That is undermining us as socialists. This is not an issue of whether we are in favor of migration or not. This is a question of whether we are in solidarity amongst ourselves as human beings with common problems. There are common problems. The nuclear reactor in Japan, the question of that is a problem of humanity. It is not a problem of the Japanese or the Germans or the Greeks. The question of the warming of our climate is a common problem. The financial crisis is a common problem. The question of inequality is a common problem. The question of democracy is a common problem. We have to again reunite beyond our borders and our ethnic divisions. And the right is playing on ethnic divisions and xenophobia in order to disunite the European Union and disunite our peoples. That's why I said, that's why in my speech in Poland, I ended up by saying, yes, I am proud to be Irish. Yes, I am proud to be Portuguese. Yes, I am proud to be Spanish. I am proud to be German. I am proud to be Swedish. I am proud to be Greek. We have to show what European Union is. Working together, we can deal with all these major crises. We are powerful as long as we unite within the European Union and give a new vision for our people. Yes, we can deal with climate change. Yes, we can deal with the financial crisis. Yes, we can deal with inequality. Yes, we can make our societies more equal, democratic, socially just. Yes, we can help our brothers and sisters in the Arab world that also want the same things, and Europe can play a major role. And they have shown that it is not, that democracy is not a question of culture. Democracy is a human value, a deeper human value that they want also. That is something that was being also used by the conservatives to say, oh, these Muslims or all these Arabs, they don't know about democracy. It is our societies that know about democracy. No, these are universal human values which we are fighting for. And that's why I believe that we can make the difference. We have a big fight. We are very few in government right now, but let's change Europe. Thank you very much.